Hello, I'm Merit Janow, Dean of the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University. It's my privilege to have with us today three leading experts at Columbia University on China, as well as Roberta Lipson, one of our very distinguished alumnus from Columbia Business School. I will introduce each very briefly before we go into our discussion. Tom Christensen is a professor of public and international affairs and director of the China and the World program at CIPA at Columbia University. He joined us in 2018 from Princeton University, and his career has spanned both academia and public service. He served from 2006 to 2008 as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs. Widely published, his most recent book was called The China Challenge, Shaping the Choices of a Rising Power. We also have with us today L Liebman, a professor at Columbia Law School, who also leads our Center for Chinese Legal Studies. L Liebman is widely known as a preeminent scholar of contemporary Chinese law, and he is doing a wide-ranging research on issues such as Chinese court judgments, the role of artificial intelligence and big data in the Chinese legal system. He's looked at leniency in criminal law and medical dispute settlement, securities markets, and many other areas. We also have with us Professor Shang-Jin Wei, who is the M.T. Wang Professor of Chinese Business and Economy at Columbia School of International Public Affairs and the Graduate School of Business at Columbia University. From 2014 to 2016, Dr. Wei served as Chief Economist of the Asian Development Bank, and earlier in his career, he served at the IMF as well. Professor Wei is a noted scholar on international finance, trade, and macroeconomics and China. We're very pleased to have with us also Professor Roberta Lipson. Roberta Lipson is CEO of Chindex International and chairman of the board of the United Family Hospitals. She has 30 years of experience in the healthcare industry in China. Since she co-founded Chindex in 1981, the company has expanded from a medical equipment distribution company to healthcare delivery. And now the United Family Healthcare brand has hospitals and clinics in many places throughout China. She is a graduate of Brandeis University and has an MBA from Columbia University and very much part of the Columbia family. Thank you all very much for being with us today. With that by way of introduction, let's just jump right in. I think this is a very important time to have a conversation about U.S.-China relations. I think we are in a very troubled and complex period, possibly one of the worst periods since normalization, certainly I think since 1989, with economic, security, political, and now health dimensions. The areas where we have cooperated in the past seem increasingly difficult in the current period, and I think we all are aware that public attitudes in the U.S. Have turned very decidedly negative. I saw a recent April Pew poll, for example, that said that 2/3 of Americans have an unfavorable view of U.S.-China relations. So I thought we might start this conversation with some general discussion about how we got here and what are the key sources of the problems as you see it and how you assess the current environment. And let me invite Tom Christensen to start us off.
Oh, thanks, Merit. It's a great pleasure to be here, and welcome Roberta back to Columbia electronically. It's great to see you. U.S.-China relations were very bad before the COVID crisis. We had a lot of points of contention. There was the trade war. There was the tech and telecom war, which I really see as somewhat different than the trade war. There was a phase one trade deal, as you know, in mid-January. I saw that as a kind of ceasefire. And I think there were some unrealistic aspects to that phase one trade deal that would make it hard to implement in any case. And now with the COVID downturn in the Chinese economy, it seems less likely, especially with commodity prices and energy prices dropping so sharply. Very hard for China to meet the goals of the phase one trade deal. So there's that issue. Then there's security. We have a lot of tensions in the security realm with military operations in disputed waters around China by both sides. There were protests in Hong Kong that raised China's concerns about domestic stability and accusations against the United States. And the suppression of protesters, of course, got a reaction in the United States that made relations worse. And then we have cross-strait relations where China's been putting military pressure on Taiwan with the re-election of a DPP president, President Tsai. And the United States seems to be upgrading its own political relations with Taiwan at the same time in the Trump administration. That's led to some tension. And then, of course, there's the repression of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, which has led to a reaction in the United States. So relations were quite bad before the COVID crisis, and they've only gotten worse since. The initial reaction in Wuhan to the crisis has received widespread criticism around the world, including in the United States. And the poor handling of the crisis in the United States early on has received criticism around the world. And unfortunately, it seems like both governments have responded to this criticism by criticizing each other. So now we have a very tense US-China relationship at a time in which, in my opinion, we should be cooperating with each other. I can't think of a more common threat than a disease, and it seems like it's quite tragic that we can't cooperate on some key issues to try to defeat that disease. And one is just to cooperate on how to stem it from spreading. I think China has a lot of lessons. Roberta can help us understand the lessons they learned, how to stem the disease, creating vaccines in a hurry, in a cooperative way, manufacturing those vaccines for the whole world's population. That would be great.
Let's hold off on those solutions till a little later in the conversation.
Okay. Yeah, that's fine.
I think we could have a sustained collective conversation, if you don't mind, on on what could be done. But at this moment, maybe we could put on the table as we see it, where do we stand? What are the points of tension and so forth? And you just outlined a wonderful brief summary. So let me give you a moment to conclude it.
Okay, it's just the only other factor that I didn't mention is the domestic environment in both countries, but particularly the United States in an election year. It's very clear that both political parties in the United States are focusing blame on China and focusing blame on their opponents for being too weak on China. And that will only ratchet up the tensions in US-China relations in 2020.
Thank you very much. I think let me invite others to offer just an introductory sense of US-China as it now stands. Roberta, would you like to comment at least what you're seeing in China, or come in later? I think you're on mute.
I can comment briefly also on this kind of current state of mutual enmity at a time when we should just be so closely working together. It's not only the United States that faces their domestic constituency, that the Trump administration looking to divert the situation from focus on what might have gone wrong in the US on COVID. But I think there's a similar thing going on in China, and I think that's probably of concern as China still isn't completely out of the COVID situation. And I think that unfortunately this China blame, China hate that's going on in the United States possibly leaves, as level-headed as the Chinese leadership might be, leaves not much choice but to respond somewhat in kind. I think till now the response has been somewhat constrained, but if we keep pushing China into a corner, and I think we've seen that time and again, eventually they're going to have to strike back. And right now, we're still hearing about trade talks about to restart, and that's a good thing. But I'm not sure they're going to be talking about the right things that need to be talked about. I get the impression that the talk is going to be about how much trade can happen and not about the structural issues that need to be fixed in order for us to work more closely together on scientific and medical collaboration.
Thank you very much. Love to come back to you a little later on that scope for collaboration and the areas where our two societies are well suited to focus on healthcare issues. Then may I invite you to offer a comment?
Sure. So thank you. Thanks for having me. So I agree with everything that's been said. Let me just add maybe 2 points quickly. The first is that it's important to recognize that the roots of this problem lie on both sides. There can be a temptation in one country or the other to think of it as a one-sided problem that ties to a certain person coming to power in either country, but it's important to realize that the roots are on both sides and they run quite deep. I actually think it's also, a second point is to realize that I think the roots really go back to the financial crisis, 12, 13 years ago, how China perceived the US response then, and how China perceived the US as being a country in decline, China as a rising power, and then following on from that, China's perception that the US was actively seeking to keep China down, to keep China from taking what China views as its rightful role as a world leader. So I think that the crisis has made it worse, but it's also important to realize these roots go very far back. I also want to emphasize something Tom said, that I think that in the US, some of the policies that China has pushed domestically, whether it's the crackdown in Xinjiang, the repression in Xinjiang, or the tightening of control on academic institutions, has made cooperation much more difficult even before we got to the trade war and the current crisis.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. In a way, what Ben Liebman has just said is a wonderful transition to Shang-Jin Wei, because as you comment on the state of U.S.-China, maybe you could also help us understand what you think of as the current state of the Chinese economy, because really in the aftermath of the great financial crisis, China took extraordinary measures to stimulate demand, which contributed to global growth. The current environment now make it harder for China to do that. You will have expert views on that. And so help us understand from your assessment of the economy as well, the state of U.S.-China economic relations.
Thank you, Merit. In Chinese economy, in the first quarter, February, March, up to mid-April, was doing extremely badly. The very first negative growth rate recorded essentially in the last 30-some years, and was the country, I guess, was banking on a recovery as robust as the post-SARS crisis in 2003. But before the COVID-19 became a global pandemic, so once other countries, let's recall in 2003, if you look at annual growth rate of Chinese economy, if you ask someone who knew nothing about SARS and ask the person to identify which year was the year of SARS, the answer is you cannot find it. In fact, in 2003, the whole year growth rate was strong enough that means the post SARS also involved something like around 2 months of a partial lockdown in Guangdong, Beijing, and some other areas. But the post pandemic recovery was strong enough that you couldn't see it in the growth number for the whole year. So China was banking on that before this became global pandemic. Now, of course, since most of the major trading partners of China, United States included, are in economic recession so severe that almost surely Chinese economy is also affected by that. Chinese economy, of course, is also a lot more integrated with US and with the rest of the world today than 17 years ago. Now, so that's one important thing to keep in mind. The other thing to keep in mind is that today, for a few years by now, Chinese overall growth rate has been on a downward trajectory. Per se, it need not be a problem, given the demographic features, given how much higher Chinese wage rate is already now relative to 17 years ago. But nonetheless, the media discussion, the rhetorics, and the national sentiment is such that lower growth rate was a source of concern before the pandemic, and the current recession make it to be even bigger problem. So that's part of the backdrop, and I think it might have played some role in also restraining Chinese response to U.S. as other panelists have pointed out. But this might change if somehow the Chinese do not see gains from continue to play this cooperative role. That's not the case yet, but there's a risk that we might get into that kind of a state.
Mm-hmm. And the phase one trade agreement was concluded in the middle of January and really came into effect in the middle of February. I think the data that will be looked at is both U.S. and Chinese. Now, one way to think about trade agreements is that they offered a structured framework for discussions between countries. At this point, it's still early in the agreement, but we are already hearing some emanating from the White House, and certainly economic conditions have changed since the agreement was struck. And I'm wondering, Shang-Jin, if you have any comments about the agreement and the conditions now, and then I'd like to invite others to comment further. We may have lost Roberta's visual for a moment, just so we're aware of that. Mm-hmm.
So the phase one trade deal that the two countries reached in mid-January, as a pause in the war, just to use the trade war rhetorics, was very meaningful in a way. The two countries, China in particular, was hoping to get back to more normal way of conducting global commerce. But the nature of a phase one agreement, one needs to point out, is a mixture of objectively desirable things, getting China to move towards stronger protection of IP, market-oriented stuff, but also some strongly protectionist measures, inducing China to use control government measures to do something now to the opposite of what we really want the China to do. So take the example of massive order of agricultural products the U.S. asked China to do, go way above what China could possibly do based on supply-demand relationships alone. So that, Chinese government might be able to deliver this, but the process of delivering this is going to cause China to move away from market-based economic model rather than towards that. So it's very counterproductive in that sense. I guess it's important to point out, even without pandemic, that's an unfortunate aspect of this. Relative to the TPP discussion, where the main the inducement or the signal sending to China is to constrain the behavior of state-owned firms, making sure modern day terminologies, competitive neutrality, treating firms of all ownership the same, negative list management. These are the things that many reformers in China wanted to do. The phase one agreement is not like that. So the phase one agreement is a mixture of stuff. Some of them are potentially very counterproductive. Number one. Number two, now the U.S. Massive fiscal package has the effect, by the logic of open economy macroeconomics, by greatly reducing government savings or greatly increasing government deficits, is going to reduce national savings. It's going to lead to massive increase in U.S. trade deficits against all trading partners, including China. Of course, the economic recession may also exacerbate this. So the irony is that those actions, from U.S. point of view, is probably necessary. It's going to make it much harder for China to fulfill this part of the agreement to deliver those orders. And politicians here and there may not necessarily understand the connection between fiscal policy, pandemic, and the trade deficit. All they see is explosional U.S. trade deficit this year and next year. And the first thought is, how come we've been talking to you for so long and you managed to produce an even bigger surplus against us? So I see this pandemic is going to create pandemic will create many dimensions of further tension, but just on the economic side, on the account of very likely rising U.S. trade deficit against China, we'll see another wave of tension coming down the road.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll not so much on the trade deal. I'll just say maybe one additional point, which is in terms of sort of forecasting what's going to happen in China economically, it's obviously hard. But one of the reasons it's hard is I think it's still too early to see exactly how global supply chains adjust in response to this. I mean, there's a lot of discussion in the U.S. right now of the need to protect supply chains. There's a lot of pressure, I think, especially on companies in the healthcare industry to move away from China. And I think we just have to see how much of this actually happens. So I guess the point of this is there's a degree to which China is going to be able to adopt its own economic policies to respond, but some of their response or some of the degree to manage their response is going to be dependent on what happens from outside of China, where there's a lot of calls on people to move out of China, to shift supply chains. Let me just add on this, though, that I think it's also, this ties back to what I think we all said at the start, especially what Roberta and Tom said, which is that I think there's a lot of realization in the US also now that beyond the headlines about, we were getting supplies from China, that there were other problems with our supply chain, right? That there was very little slack in the system. And so this is another area where I think, China may be vilified when in fact there may be much broader problems with the supply chain. I'm sure Roberta knows more about this than I do when it comes to the healthcare sector, but I do think that it's early. It's still early in terms of forecasting what this means for China, and especially in terms of China's engagement economically. The final point I'll say about this is that China is pretty much sealed off in many ways from the outside world, and that will have consequences the longer that goes on. It's more sealed off from the outside world than the U.S. is, and we're just going to have to see how long that lasts and what the economic consequences are of that as well. I mean, if this pandemic goes on for a year, 18 months, 2 years, it's going to present real challenges, I think.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Tom, would you care to comment further on the economic relationship or the trade agreement or the conditions as you see them?
Yeah, I think that the phase one trade agreement, I agree with Shang-Jin entirely. It was a ceasefire in the trade war, and there were some good aspects of it, IPR protection. We've had promises of IPR protection before, so that's really not new in the sense that China claims always that they want to protect IPR for their own sake and for the sake of the international economy, but the proof is in the pudding, so it takes time to prove that. The other parts of it really are managed trade, as Shang-Jin said. They're not free trade aspects to those targeted numbers. And I think they're highly political numbers in the following sense. The baseline of comparison for the purchases that China has committed to is 2017. And there's a reason for that. That's when the Trump administration took office. So the Trump administration wants to say, we sold more stuff to China than when we came in. The problem with that is the trade war that was launched by the Trump administration over the last couple of years has reduced the overall trade. So to have a big increase over a 2017 baseline was already rather dramatic in purchases from China. And now you add to that a recession in China, and it's going to have to take a lot of artificial purchases from China to meet those goals within the first couple of years. So I was always a bit skeptical about the phase one trade deal, and now with energy prices bottoming out and you have a commitment to buy $54 billion more energy products in the next 2 years from the United States, when just a week ago oil had a negative value to the barrel. That's going to be really hard to do. I mean, the more you buy, the more you owe, in a sense. So it's going to be very difficult to do. And of course, from the very beginning, China said, "Oh, this is all based on demand anyway." So that was always a kind of, these kind of wiggle words to get out of the deal, a kind of escape clause. So I expect it to be a problem, but the other political aspect, and I'll just conclude with this, is that, as you know, Merritt, the trade statistics come out in the United States in the early part of the year. So we're not going to find out that China's behind in its schedule until early 2021, and that'll be after the presidential election. So I think it was structured that way. And I expect to hear all sorts of positive things from the US government about how the phase one trade deal is actually being met, whether or not it's being met, so that they can claim they had one success in their trade negotiations.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. Shang-Jin, and then I'd like to.
Can I add one or two more points on how the trade war is affecting U.S. negatively, even in the current pandemic fight? Number one, more directly, part of the Trump administration's trade war was to apply very high tariffs on imports from China, including PPEs. Most of the PPEs were facing a higher tariff between 15 to 25%. 25% is higher than the Smoot-Hawley level tariff. The U.S. tariff level, we all been telling our students that Smoot-Hawley tariff was a thing of the past. But U.S. actually has managed to raise tariff on imports from China to the Smoot-Hawley level, or very close to the Smoot-Hawley level, including PPE products that have obviously a very direct impact on it. Now, in the last 2 months, USTR has offered a temporary exemption to PPE product imports. But research tells us from the previous experience of so-called the PNTR experience that temporary tariff cut is not good enough, because there's always this uncertainty there. In terms of incentive to PPE producers, it's not the same thing. So I don't want to just get into a business and sell for 2 months and then go move to some other business, right? So the U.S. policy, even with the temporary tariff cut, essentially puts a chilling effect on producers. China happened to have being the world's largest producers of PPE in supplying the things really needed in the current pandemic. That's number one. Number two, even for the other non-PPE tariff on other non-PPE products, they are, we need to recognize the U.S. tariff on those things are part of a tax on households. You are cutting down real income households. Here we are in the middle of a pandemic. We think about generous fiscal package, monetary policies to help households. But at the same time, we leave unchanged another policy, completely man-made or government-controlled policy that reduces household income, raises cost of production to U.S. firms, in a way working at cross purpose with other parts of the policies we put in place to try to help firms and households. And that has not received enough discussion. I think, part of the thing that universities and think tanks can play is to get us recognize that, we can reform trade policy and other things in ways without raising burden on tax holders, can help ourselves, can help our households, and can help our firms.
Let me now turn to Roberta Lipson, if our telecommunications is full. In terms of the pandemic and how China is dealt with it, we're seeing from a healthcare perspective. This obviously isn't the first infectious disease crisis the world is experiencing, China has experienced. And of course, already reference has been made to SARS. Could you share with us some of the lessons you think that were learned and were not learned from SARS and the extent to which that relevant today?
To go back historically a little bit further, healthcare collaboration has always been a real bright spot in the relationship with our countries. And going back all the way to like ping pong diplomacy times, this people-to-people healthcare contact, exchange, collaboration has been something that's grown and existed through every administration since the 70s. And although prior to the SARS time, prior to 2003, China was primarily focused on economic growth, and things like public health were not necessarily in the forefront of their mind. But SARS came around and changed all that. And it was really interesting that luckily, when SARS came around, there were already collaboration programs between the US and China happening. There were programs through the CDC, through HHS, and through NIH. And lots of capacity building programs with US experts on the ground, working side by side in an operational way with their Chinese counterparts. So when SARS happened, kind of took us all by surprise, but there were people working together in areas around that. There was already a program for re-emerging diseases. And there were people working on flu and collecting samples on flu virus every year. And there were people working on other communicable diseases. And so when SARS came around, it was very natural for these people to come together and talk to each other. And we were, at the time of SARS, designated as a screening clinic for international population, although Chinese people could be screened at our hospitals as well. And it was very interesting because at the beginning of SARS, well, the whole SARS period was surprisingly a lot more political from the domestic perspective than my experience this time with COVID-19. So when it first started coming out that there was a problem with SARS in 2003, we needed to bring, the diagnostic criteria were not as clear. It was more of an art than diagnostic criteria for COVID. And so every suspected case we had to bring to the experts committee in the Beijing government. And at the beginning of the epidemic, it was very hard to convince them of a positive case because they were denying the fact that there was an issue at all. And then in the middle of the epidemic, every case we brought to them was confirmed as positive. And that's because they were coming out to the world that they were dealing with this and it was a situation. And then toward the end again, when it was supposed to be over, it was impossible to convince the experts committee that there was a case. Positive cases had to be transferred to special infectious disease hospitals. So it was important to have it accurately decided. During the COVID-19 breakout here, in the beginning, obviously, there were political reasons that we were slow to learn of the situation, that maybe a week or two was wasted in the local government dealing with their own political exigencies. They had their big meeting to be had and were concerned about coming out perhaps with the situation. But I think as soon as there was recognition that there was people-to-people transmission and the government knew about it, there was a really beautiful and impressive concerted effort to manage the situation on a national basis, and through the subsequent government offices, from national government to province to city to district, that perhaps only could be concerted in such an organized way in China. Perhaps only the Chinese system is capable of doing that. And from the day that I got back at the end of January, I was every day hosting inspection groups, but inspection groups from China CDC, from China CFDA, from the Ministry of Health. And unlike during SARS, where we were kind of all busy trying to gather information from CDC and WHO about what to do and learning together, the Chinese government knew exactly what they wanted us to do. They came into our hospital and they said, you have a nice fever clinic, but it's not going to be big enough for the epidemic. You need to close down, make it bigger, change the workflows, change the airflows. And almost every day until today, we have visits from the government, making sure we're following the government recommendations and doing the right thing. And as such, we have not had one staff member infected. And the infection rate in Beijing was much lower than the infection rate during SARS. So, so learnings, there are lots of things that these I think the other thing is that the Chinese people learned from SARS. Having had the experience of SARS, Chinese people were ready to put on the masks. They were ready to socially distance, very much unlike what I'm seeing in the United States. So, the downside and the sad side of what's happened differently, as far as I'm concerned, is rather than, finally facing a common enemy, it's the time that we should have put all of the problems aside and said, how can we work together to make this enemy go away? How can I offer you what I've learned, and how can you accept it? But I'm not seeing any of that happening. And I could go into a little bit of the history of why I think specifically in this case it's not happening, if that's of interest.
Well, thank you. Yes, let's come back to that. And I do want us to all focus on the end on what could be done in the best case scenario. What's the potential for it? But I think Ben has also been observing what other countries are doing, should you wish to comment on that, and countries in the region as well.
Sure. So maybe I'll make just two comments. One is about China, one is about other places. So I think what Roberta said is extremely helpful. Obviously, she's on the ground in a way that the rest of us are not. And the legacy of SARS is incredibly important. It's important in China, it's important in Taiwan, in South Korea, SARS, MERS as well. On China, it seems pretty clear to me that China's governance system both made delayed the response initially, right? It incentivized local officials to cover up, to keep the news quiet. There's actually some legal unclarity here as to whose responsibility it actually was. There's conflicting rules on this. But it seems pretty obvious that in the run-up to a sensitive, both the holiday and also the annual 2 meetings in Hubei, right, the initial response was to cover up. And that suggested that lessons of SARS had not been learned, and that's a problem of the governance system. But equally, as Roberta said, once they decided to act, right, they clearly had learned the lessons of SARS. And that's sort of the sad irony here, is that it's the same system that both initially led to the cover-up and then also facilitated a pretty impressive response once they started responding. And in particular, in the case of China, drew on existing institutions of social control, huge numbers of people at the sort of village level, neighborhood level, who are able to be called into action to do the type of bootstraps monitoring that you really need to do. It seems pretty clear to stem a outbreak like this. I'm sort of struck still. I mean, here we are in New York, where we're still talking of, can they hire 1,000 disease trackers, right? I mean, and Wuhan had 10 thousands of these people almost immediately, right? And we're here months into the epidemic in New York, and we don't have they're trying to hire 1,000 people now, many months into this. So that's the first one. Second point is, right, I'm not an expert I'm not an epidemiologist, I'm not an expert on public health, but if you look at other places that seem to have done a pretty good job, South Korea, Taiwan, Vietnam actually has done very well. It's not a place I know well. I know what's going on in Taiwan a little bit better, right? So I mean, what is it that's contributed to success? Part of it is a shared history with SARS, right? Especially Taiwan. I mean, these are countries that responded very strongly to SARS. In the case of South Korea, to MERS, built up public health institutions that were ready to respond. And second, responded really quickly with incredibly effective tracking of people coming in. I mean, the Taiwan success as a fairly open society with basically, single-digit deaths, only a few hundred cases, is really remarkable. But I think it comes down basically to having a good healthcare system, fairly high level of public trust, and as Roberta suggested, a public who bought in immediately to the need to take precautions. And so I guess the point here is it doesn't necessarily, some of the solutions don't require having an authoritarian system, but they do require having an effective healthcare system and a population that will buy into this, that will trust the state when the state says, we need you to do this, we need you to social distance. And obviously, as we've seen in the US, the response has been much slower here in terms of both getting the government to respond and also getting public buy-in.
Shang-Jin, did you wish to comment further on that?
I would add is another difference between this episode and the SARS episode is the availability of a new technology. So internet, fintech, and so on plays a very important role. Let me give two examples. One is this digital payment greatly essentially provides a cushion to the consumption force. So now the Chinese households find it easier to social distance because they can hide in their homes, make order online, payment is digital, delivery systems very well developed even before the pandemic. They really help. That's number one. Number two, in terms of a recovery or coming out of the pandemic, another role of the technology that we are seeing is something called health code, 健康码, health code, where everyone's phone, anyone who has any test being recorded in hospital or records will be utilized in the background, and the code, Roberta can correct me, I understand in many places people have on their phone code, have a colored code. Green means there's no test that shows you are infected, you have not traveled outside your region to places of risk. And red means you've been tested positive, or there's suspicion that you might be in high risk, and there's a yellow code for something in between. And this code, at least in principle, can be updated on a real-time basis. That's actually very important because in terms of coming out of this, how to get people to go back to work, how to get people to go feel comfortable going to shopping mall. A problem that we're going to be struggling here in the US and Europe. Yeah, I think it's very useful. People go to a shopping mall, the people the security guard at the shopping mall will check to make sure you have a green code. And you also walk into shopping mall knowing that everyone else you're going to run into, shop assistants, other customers, at least there's a check. The check probably is not perfect, but it's a lot better than we have to make our individual guesses. One of the concerns we have in the States and Europe about speed of recovery is that even if pandemic is medically being largely controlled, would you get people feel comfortable enough to go back to work, go back to shopping mall, go back to do whatever the life requires them to do? So I think that piece also plays a useful role in China. Because of the concern for privacy and others are different, and availability of technology is different, we might need to do something different here. The collaboration between Google and Apple might be something close to that. That's also a phone, a smartphone-based kind of a thing that not only tell you your health status, but also potentially status of your coworkers, other shop customers, and so on. But these the newly available technology, I think, also play a useful role in the current epidemic relative to the SARS. I want to just add that point.
Can I just add one sentence in this, which is it's important to realize also, South Korea and Taiwan, both liberal democracies, also have used technology very effectively. They come up with a different balance between privacy and individual, and privacy rights and the collective interest. And so it's been easier, and these are systems protected by very strong, courts where the governments have been able to roll out technology, but partially because there's greater buy-in and partially because maybe there's a little less concern about some of the privacy protections.
Yeah, Ben, there's a great story from Taiwan that's illustrative of your point. Someone was told to quarantine himself in his apartment, and his cell phone gave his location to the government, so they knew that he was in his apartment. And his cell phone battery went dead, and he said within 45 minutes there was a police officer at the door to see if he was there. And that's in a liberal democracy. So it can be done that way as long as people, as you say, buy into the system and say, this is a responsibility that you have as a citizen to the broader public. And Taiwan did a great job, and that's actually caused a lot of tension in cross-strait relations, because Taiwan's great job has been the occasion for Taiwan to push for more inclusion in international institutions, including the World Health Assembly and the World Health Organization, and that's led to a lot of tension in U.S.-China relations.
Well, every society is going to have to come up with their own methodologies within their own regulatory, privacy, and other values. We're seeing tremendous complexity in the United States. I think you've heard our own governor in New York talk about an expanded election effort. John Hopkins, I think Shang-Jin Wei referenced Google, Apple, with collaboration, which I think is going to be based on voluntary opt-in, by citizens. That's another. Each state is developing tracing staff. We are doing so as all the great universities are working on this problem and coming up with digital solutions, data collection. So really there's a national mobilization in this country around this challenge. But we have different roles of the state and different tolerances also. And I wonder if you would say a little bit more about that, Roberta, what your sense is about public attitudes in China towards the measures that have been taken. You've mentioned that they've been very effective, and you're seeing very few cases now of that dramatic diminution of cases.
Yeah, I mean, the cases are way down. There are almost 350 cities, I think, that have 0 cases. I think the number is still 19 cases, 19 cities that have some cases. So I truly worry about the US, if it's going to be voluntary opt-in for these precautions, and one state's going to do it one way and another state another way, I'm afraid this virus doesn't know about state lines. And you don't know who's opted out and who's opted in, and who to stay close to and who to stay far away from. Beijing basically opened up all of its parks, all of its shopping malls, all of its most of its retail stores, restaurants, but with social distancing. People are all still wearing masks, even though it's not absolutely mandatory. Today, the Ministry of Health, this I think is interesting. We all get temperature taken when we leave our house in the morning, when we get to our office, when we ride into the office park, when we walk into the office building. If we go into the store, we have to show our green arrow. And yes, it is a feeling of comfort. And I was very interested today to see that the Ministry of Health issued guidance on primary schools and nursery schools to get ready to return to school. And their advice was that students would not have to wear masks in the school compound or in classrooms. And the social media response to that was just totally negative, saying either don't go back to school or wear the damn masks. We don't want our kids exposed. And, this seems so much in contrast from the US, where people are just chomping at the bit to get to their nail parlor. So, yeah, different. And we're talking about this kind of really careful opening up and people being very willing to take on these issues, these protective issues, where there's already 0 cases in over 300 cities. I think there were 37 cases this week, 64 last week, 37 this week in all of China, most of them imported and most of them asymptomatic. So, it's already down to a really low level with very few hotspots, and people are still not wanting to risk it because as anxious as you may be to get back to the economy, another wave is going to send the economy down the drain again. So.
Well, could you speak a little bit to this issue that we've all been referencing, which is, imagine a better degree, a higher degree of collaboration that you can imagine, the best you could imagine, between the U.S. and China on these issues. At the outset, Tom suggested, and it's in a very good article, that we could collaborate more on vaccines, and there really is more scientific healthcare collaboration. What's the level of trust you have to do that? What would be the steps you could imagine could unfold?
As I say, healthcare was a bright spot that over the last 2 years has fallen into the basement, the dark, dark basement. We had so many good collaboration programs between our governments, between academia, within industry, and just the level of mutual suspicions based on suspected IP infringement, and that I think has been very much whipped up by the government. I mean, there's always good players and bad players in every collaboration, but so many good things have come out of the collaboration between the US and China. I mean, for years and years, we're gathering the flu samples, and that's the programs that we've had, the capacity building programs in epidemiology and various training programs. They've accrued to the benefit of the US as much as to China, although I must say a lot of the government programs had been mostly funded by the US. That funding's now completely run out. And whereas we used to have scores of US public health experts and scientists on the ground in the US Embassy, right now it's down to a handful of people, and they're mostly new people that have come in the last year or two, and they don't have their networks in China. And that was part of the problem when the epidemic came up. There weren't people on the ground talking to each other. The people that were involved weren't talking to each other. So there was no starting point for this conversation. What we could do together, what we couldn't do together. We're the two countries with the most brilliant scientists and development labs in the world. How much better would it be if we took advantage of each other's information and worked together? If one of us comes out with a vaccine first and hoards it and uses it only for our own people, it's as if the world doesn't have a vaccine. Because, as I say, this virus knows no borders. We're going to have to find some equitable way of distribution. So even if we can't collaborate on manufacturing and development, we had better collaborate on distribution. So of the 108 vaccine projects, I think 8 of them are in clinical trials now. And of the 8 in clinical trials, 3 of them are in China and 3 of them are in the United States. And then I think France and Germany are involved in some collaborative ones. But there is not one collaborative project between the US and China. The only collaboration is Pfizer has offered a license to a Chinese company for distribution should the vaccine come to market, which is good. It's a start. But yeah, I think if we don't figure out a way how to talk, and if we can't talk bilaterally, the WHO has offered a platform to talk multilaterally. Mm-hmm. On April 26th, the WHO came out with a task force to work together on developing vaccines and testing and distributing and developing therapies. And 30-some countries and NGOs signed up to be part of this. The next week, China signed up to be part of it. But the US is completely out of the picture. We're not talking to anybody. So not only that, as we don't talk to anybody, China becomes more influential. And even in our neighboring countries in Latin America, that's going to have a problem. Africa, that's going to have a problem. Nobody's turning to the United States for help. But if Africa blows up, because if Africa has a huge epidemic problem, they're also going to have a huge social problem. And, where is that going to leave the world? I'm worried, I have to admit.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Those are really important insights for all of us. And I think our other colleagues here have each observed some of the global effects and the increased role that China is playing in Latin America and in Africa that also warrants China to step up in support of those countries and regions as this continues to unfold. I think we are down to our last few moments, so let me just invite, I think you've given us a powerful framework and very current information that some of us really don't have, so thank you very much for that, Roberta, and invite our three Columbia scholars to offer some concluding thoughts each as well, starting with Tom.
Thanks, Mary. I really learned a lot from Roberta, as I always do, and I think that it's really important to emphasize the global aspects of this because we're going to have more waves in the future because we're not going to have a distributable vaccine in soon enough time to prevent future waves. So it's going to be a global crisis, and my sense is that vaccines and things like that are helped by collaborative research, but it's kind of genius. Someone will come up and crack the code and figure out how to create a good vaccine. But the distribution of vaccines is not genius, it's planning. And it takes advanced planning on how to distribute whatever vaccine is created around the world to all citizens of the world. It's going to be an enormous logistics challenge. And the idea that the United States and China, who have the greatest capacity to help in this score as two nations, are fighting with each other and not planning in advance for that distribution is a real tragedy. And the other piece that Roberta alluded to is this is going to cause huge financial problems, both for the global financial system and also for individual countries in the poorest parts of the world. And if we don't manage multilaterally the debt crisis that's going to happen in the developing world, it's going to be a challenge for the international financial system. And if we don't help with the healthcare in the poorest nations, that's going to be a tragedy. We did pretty well with Ebola on a multilateral basis, and we need to do well here. And I just have one last point, which is I really believe that one of the solutions to this sense that we're vulnerable to imports in a crisis like this is to bolster strategic reserves in all the different countries of various products. That's a much better solution than trying to produce everything at home in all the different countries, because the efficiency losses of trying to produce everything at home will be massive. And it will also hurt international relations at a more abstract level if economic nationalism takes over as a result of this crisis. So I think all countries, and we can talk to China about that. We've done that in the energy sector when I was in the government to encourage China to create strategic reserves so that they felt more secure, so that they didn't have to have relations with some countries we didn't like that were so close, like Iran, et cetera. It's a solution to a problem without cutting into the basic concept that international trade and market economics are the best way to go. And I'll just conclude with that. I think it's really terrible. And I wanted to say one thing before we close about the Wuhan lab and the idea of a leak. Maybe it was a leak, but the solution to that, if it was from insufficient safeguards, is to help create better safeguards, because that kind of research is really important on viruses. And if it leaked from the lab, we should be talking about how to make it safer, not creating lawsuits and trying to sue each other internationally.
Thank you, Tom. May I invite Shang-Jin Wei for a final comment?
Okay, just two comments. One is, clearly there's a strong case for closer collaboration on the pandemic solution to the pandemic. Besides what my colleagues have said, I would suggest in the production of vaccine and finding a way to bring up the schedule. There's a lot of room. There's a necessity for collaboration. So let me explain this a little bit. In the normal course of the vaccine development, we started with 108 ideas. We went down to 28, and maybe one or two will be successful. Then we start to produce them, and this will take. This is what underlines this 18 months, 24 months kind of estimate. If there's a way to shorten their schedule, US, China, the whole world will benefit. IMF, this is an idea a group of economists have been proposing. So IMF is estimating the whole world will suffer a collective economic loss on the order of $9 trillion, which means if we can shorten the schedule by 1 month, we'll save something on the order of $370 billion. We can shorten by 2 months, it will be $700 billion. What does the number tell us? No, suppose we do not wait for the vaccine to be proven safe and effective before we start to produce, but rather we start to produce now. So all vaccines, we start to produce now. By the time we can show 1 or 2 of them to be safe and effective, we'll have enough volume ready to be distributed, and they can offer a chance to shorten the duration of the pandemic by 2 months or even longer. We don't normally do this because 8 out of the 10 vaccines, or maybe more, may turn out to be a waste. Right? So we don't want to generate waste. But how much waste are we talking about? People talk to this group of people talk to pharmaceutical companies, get the data of a past vaccine development. They estimate that if you just produce 8 vaccines, uselessly, 8 useless vaccines, and they go to waste, it will cost something between $200 billion to around $200 billion or so. Much smaller than you can save. I misspoke because I added 1 zero. It's about $30-40 billion or so. So the waste in terms of monetary value is much smaller than what the world can save by being able to advance or shortening the duration of the pandemic. The next important question is: this is clearly a global public good. Who can afford to subsidize this? We need. Here's an area where collaboration between U.S., China, and other countries will play a role there. So that's just one concrete example of collaboration can help. And then beyond pandemic, of course, there are so many problems for the world, including climate change, that without the collaboration, without the action with U.S. and China together with other countries, there's very little hope that we can find a productive solution. So we hope that the politics of the pandemic will not make it less likely for future collaboration.
Thank you very much, Shang-Jin. And let me just say on your first point, I think that the Gates Foundation and the Wellcome Trust and other private companies are collaborating around a therapeutics accelerator on that assumption that, let us not just find the single most likely to succeed, but duplicate, even if there is some so-called waste associated, till we have really much more advancement to be able to drive towards a cure, which I think is really a different mindset for drug development and crucial at this moment. So thank you for bringing that up. Ben, the final word.
Thanks. On collaboration, I agree with everything that's been said. Maybe I'll just add, this is a non-empirically based point, but I still think, this goes back to something Roberta said, that we're just not doing enough to learn from China's experiences yet. That China really does have good scientists, good doctors. There are pockets of collaboration. There is learning, especially many Chinese American medical professionals have done a really great job in connecting with professionals in China. But to date, there is less learning from China than there is learning from Europe. And there's much to be learned here. And again, I say that as a non-expert, but just a general sense that there's so much research being done in China, and obviously we can benefit from that as well as can China benefit from research being done here. But we shouldn't underestimate how much we can learn from China's experience. Second, one of the things that makes this hard is the rise of racism in both countries. Anti-Asian, anti-Chinese racism in the United States, anti-foreign sentiment generally in China. This is presenting a challenge, and at a moment in which we need human-to-human collaboration, I think both our governments are failing us in terms of setting a climate in which we can further collaboration. And so both governments seem hell-bent on blaming the other and portraying the risk is coming from outside, when, as we know, this is a common risk we face everywhere. It's the virus, as many have said before, is not Asian or American. And then the final point I'll say is, I think the question this all raises, of course, is for us, is what can we as universities do to respond? And there are obviously many things being done at our university to respond from the sciences to the social sciences. Obviously, keeping ourselves open to the world is a very important part of that, in my view. Making sure that the best young scientists, students, can come from all over the world, including from China, is just incredibly important, I think, to addressing these problems long term. And finally, I'll just say, it's an obvious point that one of the great things a university can also do is call our leaders out when they fail to meet up to the ideals that are important. When they fail us, we need to point it out, and that's obviously something many people are doing here, and we need to do that with regard to what's happening at government in the United States and in China.
Thank you very much, Ben. One of the joys of Columbia University is to work with colleagues like yourself, deep experts looking at facts, doing empirical work, analyzing conditions, and bring in our wider community with great leaders like Roberta Lipson, who has vast experience on the ground and is really making a difference as well. Thank you all for a fantastic conversation. I think Columbia is doing empirical work, a great deal of medical work in China, around the world, as well as deep social science in these fields. We could have a next conversation on the role of the university. Let's do it. But for today, thank you all so much. It's been a fantastic experience.